All right, we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and good evening to those who are in different time zones. Or good noon to all my East Coasters. Good to have everybody here. We're gonna run through some of the usual that we do, and good to see familiar faces and new faces. Of course, let's be nice. Let's make sure not to be a jerk. But overall, this group has always been great. So I'm just having this slide real quick to make sure we're all on the same page. And feel free to actively participate. Cameras on, and feel free to raise hands or unmute and jump in with any questions during this call. It's meant to be a community call, right? Not a TED Talk for an hour. So definitely want to get all of your thoughts and want to hear from all of you. So about the team that kind of works on this community call slash runs it. Our team is actually managing the overall Terraform on Azure experience. Big surprise there. But we also are managing the Azure deployments experience. So anything infrastructure as code goes through our broader team. That includes Bicep and ARM templates. And also Pulumi and Ansible for anyone who uses those. And we are sister teams with the folks at the CLI and PowerShell teams, as well as some of the folks over at the portal. So we have a very tight-knit group that is just working on a frictionless experience through deploying in whatever tool you pick. And the reason we started this community call was because we felt like a lot of you weren't being heard in terms of the active investment that we were making into this whole entire Azure Terraform ecosystem. So this call is meant to really help the community just get behind the scenes on sort of what we are working on and what we are sort of top of mind with. And it really is an opportunity to also have you just register or submit a talk. We are definitely trying to get more of those in the upcoming, months. And we want to make sure that all of you are aware that we are, just really trying to lean in and hear from all of you. So current community investments, we have the Slack. If you haven't joined that, please do. If you don't have the Azure Terraform form, definitely fill that out. Make sure to present if you have anything that you think is worth um, sharing with this group. We've had some really cool people. Uh, we've had some blog posts that we've done. I know those haven't been there for a while. We've done some other blog posts that are somewhat related, if you will, on AzAPI and some of the HashiConf announcements that we made. And then there's our YouTube channel and our Twitter. And that about covers everything from an overview perspective. So I will keep the ball rolling. I'm going to jump right over to the content that we have today. This is an old slide. This is V1.13, but we are going to talk a little bit about the AzAPI 2.0. So if you weren't here last time, we talked about the improvements we made to the Azure Export for Terraform tool, as well as Azure Copilot supporting Terraform, and we walked through some workflows there. Those were really just deeper dives, if you will, into our HashiConf session. But now what we are going to try to do is jump right into AzAPI and help sort of unwind some of the details there. Josh, we definitely will make sure to send that over. So for the AzAPI provider, the workflow that we kind of had talked about is this infra developer who has an environment that they're trying to provision. You have a load balancer, container app, PostgreSQL. There are a bunch of things going on here, but one of the changes that has kind of been wanted from this infra dev is, hey, can I add a container registry? So they haven't exactly worked with the container registry too much. They have some familiarity, but one of the big things that we consistently will talk about with AzAPI is that if you want the latest features and functionality for container registry, that is something that you can do through AzAPI as a provider. So would definitely give two big thumbs up if you're trying to stay with the latest and greatest. Hey, Thomas, just saw your thing. Sorry, we've been a little bit of a slacker in terms of responding to those emails. There is a way to check if you're registered. If you put in your request 3 weeks ago, you probably should have been approved. If that doesn't work, please send me a message. We'll make sure to take care of you.
Will do. Thank you.
Awesome. So we're trying to figure out, hey, how do I do AzAPI 2.0 with container registry? Looks like there's a lot of stuff going on in 2.0. So we've gotten rid of, first of all, JSON from the provider altogether. And we know that people don't love JSON. So definitely make sure to check out the provider. It's all HCL now. That means you can do for each loops. You can do all the clarity with JSON that you would hope for. We have clarity for outputs now. So before, you didn't really know that much in terms of what can I export / what can I not export in terms of outputs. But now we have these two ways. Essentially, one is a map and the other one is a list. They basically are abilities to drill down into the path of the output property or the ability to just get that actual value. In terms of the actual excuse me, way that will look, here is an example using one of the new features called AzAPI resource list. This is actually just for this example, we're actually trying to list all of the resources underneath this subscription that are of a type of virtual machine. And you can see that there's that response export values equals, and that is actually just exporting all the outputs that we get. And you can see that we kind of call that whole thing by doing AzAPI resource action dot export, and you can kind of grab the information from there. And one quiet thing that's hidden in there is that if you have a client config, that is now supported in AzAPI as well. So native HCL and Tonino, making sure I don't say that wrong. The Azure M provider is also getting all the, or it's always had HCL. There's never been anything other than HCL there. It's just that AzAPI, when we first released it, had JSON encoding and JSON decoding. Wasn't the best experience. So again, if you want to, feel free to raise your hand for any of these questions and come off mic and turn on your camera. Love to see faces, love to interact with any of you. So not calling out Antonino or anyone, just let's keep it friendly. And I will keep reading your questions if they're in the chat for the recording. Another thing that we think is really cool, especially if you're a module developer or anyone who's trying to really handle some edge cases at scale, is the retry block. You can actually specify a retry to digest errors as they come in. If you've ever had that problem where you run into an error because the resource actually was in the middle of being created, but Terraform basically returns after its timeout hits and says, hey, this didn't get created, sorry. A retry block will sort of, in combination with timeouts, help you keep getting or checking or running that same request that you fail on. That is going to keep happening until the timeout hits, and you can extend the timeout and essentially get a really nice way of consuming those errors at scale. Another thing that we have in terms of helping consume errors is pre-flight. If you're not familiar with pre-flight, pre-flight will run policy checks, and it will have some built-in resource specific issues that if you, for example, have improperly configured address prefix, in this case, you will actually get that caught in your pre-flight validation. So let's say your config is 100 resources. If resource 48 is this VNet, you're going to fail in the Terraform plan phase. You're not going to have to go all the way to apply, wait 50 minutes, go grab a coffee, eat lunch with your coworkers, come back, and then the whole thing errors out. You'll actually be able to see these things during your Terraform plan. So we think that's really cool. And again, it supports policy, but it only supports policy for if some of you are familiar with pre-flight, it only has the ability to kind of catch some known after apply checks, if you will. The biggest problem is, of course, that, it can catch some of the denies that policy will make, but it doesn't quite have the ability to catch known after apply properties. So if you have a Mastodon Steven resource group that was randomly generated. Preflight won't actually be able to validate that resource group name. So there's a question in the chat. Do we have options to create custom preflight checks? Jared, I think you actually got it covered. Looks like you can use variable validation or preconditions. That's what I would probably say as well. Is it possible to use Azure RM and AzAPI? Of course. Terraform is by definition provider agnostic in the sense that you can sort of use multiple providers in the same exact configuration environment. So we actually are big fans of using Azure RM and AzAPI in tandem with each other. There are times that you can actually use them, to Caleb's point, on the same resource. There is a resource known as AzAPI update resource where you can actually just run an update, which essentially takes and only changes a singular property. Of course, be careful with that, because if your update is in a different environment than where your resource definition is, then you're going to get state drift. So handle that responsibly, but there are a lot of cool things that can go on there. And for example, if your Azure container app has existed since the creation, but now you want the latest functionality, you can actually sort of backdoor your way into that latest functionality by running an update resource using AzAPI, which points to the latest API version, and then slapping on the new property that is supported by that resource. Hope that all made sense. Resource discovery. So resource list, which I just showed earlier, that actually is going to be able to, under a subscription or any sort of container, if you will, is a rather abstract term, but subscriptions, resource groups, and even something like a virtual network and looking for all the subnets under it, you can actually go, and if you can define a parent ID for it, you can essentially find all the resources that apply to that scope under a certain API. So you can point to VNet, or subnet, or VM, and it'll sort of find all the stuff underneath that scope. We think that's really cool and powerful. It especially is helpful with finding things that have just kind of been dropped at some point into the abyss of state drift. The provider functions that we just announced support for, there's the ability to construct resource IDs at the tenant level, subscription level, resource group level, or management group level. So that is a really great way of just utilizing provider functions. You can also slice resource IDs into components. So you can kind of construct extension resource IDs, and that is a great way to sort of utilize some of the latest functionalities that are coming out. And then we have here just another example. In this case, we can sort of take a virtual network components and we can actually construct an entire resource ID. If that doesn't look like something that you would do, don't worry about it. There's definitely use cases for this, especially in module developments. So last thing that I'll talk about briefly is we're in the middle of figuring out some of these pieces. We actually have support today for paste as AzAPI, which means that you can take a resource JSON or you can take an ARM template and you can actually paste it into the VS Code. And if you have the actual VS Code extension installed, you will get AzAPI code, which we think is pretty cool. If you have any sort of resources that are moving from Azure RM to AzAPI, we were in the middle of working on some migration support. We're actually going back and sort of trying to do some improvements there. But we are looking at that as sort of our vNext thing that is on the roadmap. Dimitri's asking, what are the benefits of using AzAPI versus Azure RM? There are a lot of different opinions on this. We have some folks who are very passionate about it and others who are kind of iffy on it. We've actually released a statement with HashiCorp. There is a joint statement that we've made to sort of go ahead and say that, hey, here are all the different ways that we think AzAPI can be used. The biggest thing is you have resource-specific versioning. That can be a problem, but that can also be a strength, right? Because if something breaks in Azure RM provider version 4.20, you have to sit there and wait for 4.21 to 4.22 or 4.23 to roll out the fix to essentially get away from these problems, and you can't just change that one resource. You need to change the entire provider versions, right? But you kind of have to do that whole upgrade juggling. Um, I'd also say that AzAPI works more in tandem with the ways that Azure expects things to behave. There are different simplifications that go into the process that Azure does for you, and that's the big benefit there. It is simple. The configurations are straightforward. It is almost always trying to roll out features in a very stable manner. So there are a bunch of good benefits to that. If anyone wants to read up more about it, there is this. I think this is the right link. I just dropped it in the chat, but there is an aka.ms/tf/provider messaging. That is a joint statement that we have made alongside HashiCorp that basically says, hey, these two providers are great. You can take that and sort of use it as gospel. If anyone else asks, definitely feel free to drop that at them. One thing that is not mentioned there that I would personally also say is very good to keep in mind is to the point of some of the folks who have been asking. This is totally usable in tandem with Azure. You do not have to use the two as you have to pick all one or all the other. You can definitely use AzAPI for certain flows and then Azure for others. Any other questions on AzAPI? All right, let's get into a demo. I'm gonna as always, tempt the demo gods, and I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right. So again, that example that we had before, can people see this, by the way?
Yep.
Awesome. So that demo that we had before, we had the Cascade Cloud Resource Group, which had a bunch of stuff in there, the DNS, the firewall, the PostgreSQL. Now what we want to do is we want to use, and you can see here, I actually defined my resource group with Azure because I already had stuff in Azure. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to create a resource with AzAPI, and I'm going to create a container registry. So to do that, I just want to highlight here that there's a bunch of IntelliSense built into the VS Code extension. So right from the get-go, it's going to say, hey, what sort of type do you want? I can go ahead and do Microsoft.container registry, and you can see there's the version. It'll actually pull all the available versions, if you will. And then I can take a look and figure out which version do I want. I'll go to the latest stable. I don't know the latest preview API quite like that yet. And then Copilot is trying to help me name this, very kind of it. But if I control space here, I can actually get a bunch of the properties. But one thing I feel like a lot of people don't know is if you go all the way up, you can actually get a code sample. And this code sample will sort of just right from the get-go, give you a bunch of the information that you need. So you just go ahead and hit enter. It will generate this for you, and then you can go ahead and configure all of it. These are just the map defaults, I believe. Again, this isn't necessarily what you're going to want to deploy to prod. Certainly not going to work, but you can actually go and kind of build off of this and say, okay, well, now I'm going to go ahead and do azure.resourcegroup.rg.id, and you can start configuring from there. So code sampling, great way to just get started with your authoring experience here. And like I said before, there is this body piece that doesn't have any sort of problems with HCL. There's this property schema validation. You can enable it to true or false by default. It's true, I believe. And then here's that response export values that I said was there before. There is obviously the ability to set an output. So you can say, hey, I want to output ACR ID, and then you can, you can go and say, maybe my value equals AzAPI resource.acr.export response export values, and you can kind of go ahead from there and start specifying your outputs. hopefully that all makes sense. This is on a high level how you author AzAPI, but if you're also like me and you want a quick and easy fix, I'm hoping I'm not gonna run into problems with this. Um, what you can go ahead and do is you can actually go and click on something that already exists. Let's just say I'll go to the container registry because in this scenario I actually have it already. We're gonna hide those, and then what I can do is there's JSON view over here in the portal. I can click that and it'll come up with this resource JSON, and then I just need to select everything, copy it, and then I will go here and paste it. And anyone see that? It just became all real code. So this is possible. This is exactly what I think the VS Code extension can do. And if I Control Z once, you can actually see this is the resource JSON, and then the VS Code extension will basically go and actually run that. And it says here if you want to actually import this, so again, this is for the existing resource that already has a resource JSON, you can just uncomment these pieces, run this as a Terraform plan and apply, and then you will have your container registry represented in AzAPI. It's just that simple. Any questions about any of that I just ran through? Alrighty. The VS Code extension is literally the AzAPI VS Code extension. Sorry, let me make sure. I have the right one. Is there a way to share a... Let me just share my screen again. And yes, to clarify, that code transformation where it just pasted as AzAPI, that was this extension. So yes, Terraform AzAPI provider, language support for Visual Studio Code, v2.0. If you don't get v2, you're not going to be able to get the paste as AzAPI feature, but this is the one that you will want. I'm not familiar with IntelliJ, Dimitri, and at least in regards to whether or not we have a extension, but I don't know if we have that. There's a question, do you have a list of Azure resource types which are not supported currently or supported currently? I think AzAPI, for those who aren't familiar, the way that AzAPI sort of works is it actually will just it's unopinionated. It kind of functions similar to bicep and arm templates, where if something exists in the management plane today, it will just auto-generate a resource definition off of that. So anything that is management plane under Azure is supported in AzAPI. Any new versions to those APIs, any changes to those properties, also supported automatically. Azure RM, of course, is a manual implementation in Go. So definitely we are working always to try to improve that and go and sort of make sure everything is supported. But that is, again, manual because we're trying to build out a simplified experience, something that's much more straightforward. And then thank you, Jason, for dropping that into the playlist. There is this YouTube channel that we have, so definitely make sure that you go ahead and check that out because we have a bunch of calls that we've had in the past. Definitely give that a look. Any other questions? New GA VNet flow logs would be accessible with AzAPI. David, I'll take it one step further. New GA anything or new private preview or public preview anything, provided you have access to it. It's accessible with AzAPI without waiting for the Azure RM implementation. Yes, as long as it is management plane. We have support for a very limited set of data plane resources, but there is not a comprehensive set there by any means. Yes, Jared just dropped the reference to the documentation. That's sort of our auto-generated docs. In there, there is the reference that kind of points to anything that we support. So again, just to kind of hop out for a second, AzAPI is meant to be a first-class provider that you can depend upon and really use for everything management plane. Azure RM is still a great experience, and we're not planning to get rid of that. If you've loved Azure RM, it's not going anywhere, but we definitely are big fans of you using either provider. If you find yourself constantly needing to swing to the next version and just having a lot of problems with that, I think AzAPI is great. If you're a huge reusable modules person and you need to deploy modules at scale, AzAPI has a lot of granularity. One thing I didn't get to talk about just now was AzAPI resource action. So you can actually, and I know this isn't technically declarative behavior, but you can do a lot of imperative actions such as listing keys or starting and stopping a virtual machine. Nick, I see that you're asking for a graph equivalent that is auto-generated. Keep your eyes out. Something may be in the works. Data plane resources. The need to be manually updated. Yeah, so it's just because there is an issue with how in the world of management plane, everything is sort of all deterministic in its behavior. That is not necessarily the case in the data plane. For example, a private endpoint key vault, that's not going to have a deterministic endpoint that it's routed to. Conversion from AzAPI to Azure RM. There is this tool that we have been working on. I will drop it in the chat. I'm going to share with the community. We haven't really pushed it publicly yet because we're still making some improvements to it. But there is this tool called AZTF Migrate. This tool is meant to help you on a resource level. So you can actually go ahead and in there, you can specify a plan, and then you can specify a migrate. And it will go between AzAPI and Azure RM. There is support for Azure RM to AzAPI also coming out for that. The main thing that I think is difficult right now is that it only supports resources. It's not going to support like your center of excellence module that you deployed because there's no representation in that. Of course, you could apply that module and then you could actually go ahead and sort of do the migrations, but you kind of need the resources to exist today. And we're in the middle of trying to improve that experience before we go and evangelize it as the greatest thing since sliced bread. But definitely play around with it. It's a great tool if you want to try to get things started today. But it, like I said before, is only going to work on resources. So type version constraints. That is an interesting one, Stuart. I'd love to hear more about the scenario in terms of constraints. Are you looking to basically enforce that people only use certain versions? Feel free to drop that in the chat. Okay, yeah, I don't know if we have anything there. I guess my first gut reaction is that doesn't sound like something that you can necessarily do at the individual deployment level, but perhaps you can do in a module where you sort of ascribe that module to folks and then you have them consume it, and then you obviously pin to certain versions. Definitely would recommend that. And Stu mentioned AzAPI to Azure RM, the GitHub tool. That is basically what AZTF Migrate is. It just got renamed so that there's no confusion there. Learning Terraform, there is a learn path that has been created that Kevin has so graciously put in the chat already. Definitely recommend that, and then definitely recommend the set of labs that Jared also put in there. So I learned by doing. Highly recommend that you do so too. Once upon a time, I knew nothing about Terraform. It is always helpful to get thrown into the environment and face all those things. All right, thank you guys so much for all the engagement on the AzAPI. Any updates on the Terraform import automation? Yeah, so I think there was a talk about that for export. Is that what you're referencing, Sadiq? Got it. For Azure Export for Terraform, we're in the middle of figuring that out. We definitely are planning for it. We haven't released it yet. If some people have noticed, actually, we had the stuff roll forward into ms.portal, but our service itself is still in the final steps of public preview, so we've actually rolled that all back. We're hoping that we can get that all out in the next, uh, ideally by the end of the year, but hopefully we at the very latest can make an announcement in January about the public preview. And then as far as the import automation, we are in the process of working on that. And I think that will definitely be our VNext thing that we're trying to target slash aim for. All right. So glad to hear, Chris, by the way, that you love AzAPI. Um, I'm going to, for the sake of time, move to another topic. Unfortunately, to help participate in this topic, you might need to unmute, but I trust you all are brave people. But I had a question about one of the things that is top of mind for our team is we are doing a lot of thinking around Terraform's integrations with policy. So, um, Terraform and policy today, I think a lot of people have had different variations of experiences with that. I just want anyone to unmute and kind of talk about, hey, if you use policy, Azure policy with Terraform, yes, Azure policies. Um, if you're using Azure policy and you're using Terraform, like the Azure or AzAPI providers, do you have anything that you would share in terms of your experience or what you like or pain points? I think as a group, we just want to hear and lean into some of the different experiences that you have there.
Well, I think policy in general is already hard to uh, completely understand, and then to also translate that into Terraform is quite a thing when you have like a whole landing zone set up and your management structures, and it's a lot.
Caleb, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I can actually speak to a specific pain point around having a kind of robust collection of Azure policies managing whether or not resources can be deployed and what attributes are, and what settings are allowed to be set on those resources. With a specific example of for any net or any resource that has the option, the firewall settings by policy in my employer's environment by policy are not allowed to be public. As an example, so like for storage accounts, you can't deploy a storage account if the firewall, if it's set to be public, it'll be prevented by policy. And this issue, an example of an issue that we ran into is that and this wasn't with storage accounts. I don't remember the specific resource it was, but it has to do with the behavior of the Azure provider. In specifically that the way that the Azure provider was destroying resources was that it was resetting the resource to default settings, removing the configuration options before actually issuing the API call to delete the resource. And what was happening was that it would trigger our policy because it was trying to set the network access to public before deleting the resource. So for a while, we had to intervene manually to delete. I think this might have been Data Explorer or Databricks or something like that. I don't remember now. But for a long time, before we were able to get the Azure one of my teammates is listening to the call and they reminded me Service Bus Namespace was the service that we had the issue on. For a long time, we had to manually intervene and to delete those resources when needed until we were able to work with the Azure team at HashiCorp to get the provider updated to manage that resource differently. And we've had similar issues in the past or with other resources, but that's a specific example. And I think it's just kind of like a general pain point is that the way that the Azure provider interacts with resources is not always intuitive when compared to like how the portal interacts with resources. And a lot of times you'll have to adapt, either adjust your policy to adapt or adjust your processes to adapt, or hopefully you have a good vendor relationship and you can get the vendor to change things. But not everyone has that lever.
Thanks, Caleb. I just dropped a poll. Go ahead and fill that out if you're on this call, just so that I can get a general idea of the group. Stu.
I think one of the key challenges I've run into personally is with modules and not being able to specify lifecycle ignore changes. So you've got the situation where your module does one thing, policy does something else, and then the two end up sort of fighting against each other. I know we've ran into that in some AVM scenarios as well. It's been fixed as an example for DNS in certain modules, but as a general issue, it's something that we run into quite a bit. That inability to ignore aspects which are being set by policy.
So thanks, Stu. I think, Miles, one thing I would say is with the parity issue, AzAPI actually has that validation. That is what pre-flight is. That validation that occurs before deployment. The problem, of course, is I know a lot of people have workflows in Azure RM and they're tied up there, so you don't necessarily get that. But Chris.
Yeah, just a quick one. So obviously Terraform has the ability with Azure RM to use lifecycle blocks. Does it work the same way with AzAPI? Can you just use lifecycle blocks with AzAPI as well? I've never tried it yet, so I mean, not that you would tend to use them often, but talking about things that fight with each other. For instance, if you've got an Azure policy that sets tags, then you know I've seen customers want to have a policy to set tags through policy, and then obviously Terraform would fight with the Terraform, so with the Azure policy. Sorry, yeah. Anyway.
Yes, Chris, you can.
You can,
and it's the same restrictions. You have to have static content inside the lifecycle block.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you.
I think Terraform and Azure Policy are both big for a lot of people because they both kind of help you manage things at a very large scale. And then you can kind of really control, hey, this tag needs to be assigned. Hey, this thing randomly drifted out of its original configuration. But the problem, of course, is that I kind of like to analogize it to the two babies fighting over the single bottle. They kind of just are snatching at the configuration and trying to take ownership of it. Nick.
Yeah, just within our organization. So we're kind of doing the scenario that Mark's just kind of posted in. We basically use Terraform to manage the delivery of Azure Policy, and we're doing that actually in combination with a tool called Hyra, just to try and keep our code largely dry. So we define a load of our environments out in YAML, and then we're basically using that within the pipeline to basically pull that across. But we pull all of the policies into like a set of JSON blocks. They marry up very closely to the same types of definitions. So we've got stuff in there for like AKS and analysis services, and we pull all of that through and actually deliver that through the pipeline. But then the second part of that obviously sometimes kind of kicks in a bit of a challenge. But I'm kind of really hoping that maybe with something like AzAPI in the future, we can get away from having to have a dependency on a third-party tool in the middle. Just wondering if anybody else does something similar or thinks that's just entirely insane.
I give it a second there to see if someone else wants to talk about. Mark.
I was just going to respond to that. I've not heard of Higher Up. That sounds kind of cool. But I've personally used Terraform to manage Azure Policy, and I can attest that it's a pretty great experience. That being said, I've only used built-in policies. So standing on the shoulders of a giant, so to speak, right? Like there's a plethora of Azure policies that are in JSON that are published in the Azure policy. And through just manipulating the input parameters, you can get a lot of stuff done. Now, if you're building your own custom policies, it may not be as great of an experience because you have to do a lot of JSONification. But yeah, the creating policy assignments, like just with completely vanilla Terraform, like I think that experience is good. I'd be curious to hearing more about like what friction drove you guys to hire up, but it sounds like they're creating kind of a YAML based abstraction layer for maybe management groups or linking policy assignments. But
Yeah, that's exactly it. So Hira itself was came through Puppet, and we basically just use that also just to kind of make it a little bit easier for other people to kind of to read and not to have to sit there and kind of get into the weeds. But yeah, I'll have a chat with one of the other guys and maybe we can demonstrate something at another point.
Sorry, I lost my unmute button for a second. Dominic?
Yeah, so I'll just give a brief mention on what I've used Terraform for with Azure Policy. So we have kind of organically grown the policies that we have, and it was mostly deployed by hand and using some scripts. So the Canada Federal PBMM deployment has a bunch of policies that it deploys as part of its stuff, and I think that's like YAML pipelines that you're meant to deploy through Azure DevOps, and then those pipelines use a bunch of JSON to customize what the policy deployment is going to be. So we had those and some other policies deployed in our tenant, and I have created a script that will create import blocks for all the policies, definitions, and assignments. So the custom ones and like the custom policy definitions, and then all the assignments that we have just to get an overview on that. So it ends up being a couple thousand lines of HCL for every policy that we have active in the tenant. And in other areas, so for role assignments and stuff, I've created a script that automates checking the plan. So we have this definition in Terraform, and then we compare it into a plan. And if there's any changes posted, it will fail the pipeline. So that gives us the opportunity to fix the code so that it is no longer suggesting any changes as kind of a warning mechanism and saying, like, is there any drift present? So I haven't hooked up the pipelines to our policy Terraform yet, but being able to export everything and view it, it seems to have worked pretty well. So just running the plan here, it takes less than a minute to check hundreds of things, which I was quite pleased by.
And it's good to hear. There's a lot of nuances here. Stu?
Yeah, I guess just jumping in, something mentioned on the call, there's EPAC, so epac.github.io, I think the link is, which is something that gets referenced on Learn, which is quite good for doing Azure Policy through CI/CD as well. Also, we'll show you the plan and differences and has a bunch of helper scripts to get you started. So I guess temper that by saying that it's a good fit for you if you're already doing DevOps and you're already used to doing infrastructure as code. It's a fairly complicated tool, but it's got a lot of bells and whistles around it. And I dropped another one in the chat also called I think it's GetExt or something like that. That's one that I've seen referenced on Learn and is a slightly simpler version of wrapping up the same thing. And then finally, the other way which is referenced a lot is the Azure landing zone. The enterprise landing zone has a built-in mechanism for laying down all of the default policies. So if your goal basically is to lay down the standard ALZ policies with only very small adjustments, that's a really easy way to do it because it's basically wrapped up for you inside the ALZ provider.
Got it. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I think we've heard the feedback. So just want to lean in a bit and understand some of the different pieces going on here. I think our product group is taking a long stare at this, and the good thing is we work very closely with policy. We actually share the same office space, so we're actually we should be able to collaborate and hopefully get something fixed in this experience. And there's a lot, right? Because, for example, even today with the pre-flight support, we were really happy with that was a quick win. But again, it only catches if you're going to get a denial. It won't actually catch modifies, to my knowledge, which means that you can still have the same problems in pre-flight with modifying policies that add tags and all of that. But it's good to think about. All right, there are about 10 minutes left. I definitely want to go ahead and open up the floor a little bit, but also I want to take like the last 2 minutes maybe to get some logistics sorted out. But Chris.
Yeah, sorry, just one last question. It's just around obviously Terraform state files. So one of the things that I've noticed with obviously Azure is you have to always have a storage account, and then there's a whole process behind that. Is there any plans in the future for Azure to kind of have some kind of Terraform first resource that would kind of make it easier to onboard that whole thing? I don't know if there's any an easier way, like a Terraform specific place to put it, rather than just in like a storage account.
Yeah, I thought that you were able to, well, if you mean like to store it, I believe you can do it in Vault, right? Is that what you're meaning, or?
Yeah, like normally you have to obviously build a storage account, and then you put your state files in your storage account and you store the data in there. But obviously there's a chicken and egg situation where you start off with Terraform, so you can't like you can't really start that whole process. So you need a storage account before you can even start the process, if you know what I'm trying to say. So ideally you would want to build a storage account with Terraform, but obviously you've got the state file to sort of put that in. How do you deal with the chicken and the egg?
Looks like Stu, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but there's a subscription vending, looks like. I'm with you, Chris. I think there needs to be a way, it sounds like, to actually make sure that that is secure. Like, hey, is my storage account state dependent on the the storage account itself? So that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Excuse me. Yeah, to Caleb's point, there's things like TFE, HCP, and then Spacelift. These things all kind of digest that on your behalf. But Dominic?
Expanding on the chicken and the egg situation, I think that the storage account meets the needs and that the awkwardness is just an inherent feedback cycle where anything, even if we were to create a custom Terraform state file vault resource in Azure, that would itself still be something similar to a storage account that you would want to be scaffolded using Terraform. So the way that I usually do things is that in the Terraform block, you don't have the backend Azure RM block, and you do it all locally just to get the storage account existing. And then once that storage account exists, then you can uncomment your backend block and then do the Terraform state migrate, and it'll copy it all for you. But I guess the way to address the problem would be to scaffold out the code and say, okay, I want to create a new project. So if you're in Rust, you have like cargo new, and it gives you a little wizard and says, okay, what's the name of your project? So if I wanted to create a new Terraform project, either I have a storage account or I don't. So the first question would be, do you have a storage account you want to use? And if you don't, then it would ask you for the name that you want to use and where it should live. So it's okay, if you don't have a storage account, do you at least have a resource group? No. If you don't have a resource group, at least you have a subscription, right? And if that's probably where you would stop asking. But it would generate the code. So if you need the storage account and the resource group to start on your journey and having somewhere to put your state files, then it would create the Terraform for that, and it would generate all the Terraform files and even the commented out backend code. So it would say, okay, here's what you need to deploy a state file that complies with your desires on who should have access. Should it just be your IP, or is there a VNet it should be attached to? And then you can deploy that using the local state. And then the final step would be, okay, uncomment your backend block and do the migrate so that it actually lives somewhere.
Thanks, guys.
There's a ton of useful stuff in the chat. I know some people will use pre-creation using a pipeline with CI/CD. Looks like the AVM team is working to bootstrap some of that stuff with identity, IAM, and then storage. That sounds exciting. And then to Mohammed's point, merging state files is another opportunity / possibility. So, all right. Yeah, to Mark's point, anything in the world of private networking it's always fun. So I have about 5 minutes left. I'll let other people. Oh, Jeffrey, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I was just listening to some of the comments. One of the things that I was wondering, a lot of these conversations on Terraform are, deploying within pipelines, whatever, but from like the end user perspective, there's a lot of effort going on to, build these IDPs, and, HashiCorp's got their stuff going on within Terraform Cloud. I know Azure was, they had blueprints, and then they had stacks. I think they had deployment specs or template specs. Like that was sort of the end user capability within the portal to kind of provide like our modules through a native Azure experience. I was just curious, and I know we only have a few more minutes, but if there's been any involvement with your team or understanding of how maybe Terraform might be working with those products, if at all.
Yeah, so Azure Stacks, I think obviously since we work closely with the Bicep folks, my understanding of Azure deployment stacks, not to confuse with Terraform stacks, is that it really helps sort of do those deletes or do those creates or tie everything together. That is, I guess, in our eyes at least, somewhat already handled by Terraform. At least we haven't heard a clamor for that. Is that something that you're looking for in your environments, Jeffrey?
I've been poking at, we use a customer I work with uses an IDP, but natively we're looking for something more Azure-centric, like not Azure-centric, but something that's more native to customers that are in Azure, like Azure deployment environments, Azure Stack, template specs, just trying to figure out the story to tell customers on that area that makes sense from, the Azure ecosystem, I guess.
Got it. That's an interesting point. Mark?
This is, I think this is kind of going back to this idea that I've been circulating, which is how can we get third-party or 3P tool automation tools like Terraform, PoolMe, whatever, to look more like first-class citizens within the Azure portal, so that organizations, like multi-cloud is a thing, but like multi-tool, multi-automation platform is a thing, right? So within a large organization, you're going to have people doing Terraform, you're going to have people doing PoolMe, you're going to have people doing Bicep, whatever, and within the Azure portal, having kind of a cohesive view of those deployments that is uniform across whatever tooling that customers are using, I think would be ideal. It seems like that's what is driving the question, is like, okay, I want to see my deployments that are provisioned by Terraform in this case, but I want to see them show up like ARM deployments so that I can go interrogate them and see if they're happy or what went wrong or whatever. I don't know if I'm reading it right, but.
Got it. Yeah, the integrations there are always interesting / funky. So, okay, I have a minute left. My one question, and I posted in the chat too, is if people are interested, I'm curious if people still want to meet in December. I know December 19th is suspiciously close to Christmas, so I know a lot of people will be off for the holidays. I personally am flexible, and I think the team is flexible. To be honest, I think we're happy to have that gathering, but it might not necessarily be as heavy content-wise. But just wanted to get a pull of the room if people are still open and wanting to have that. All right, looks like we're getting a bunch of thumbs as soon as I'm dropping it, so I definitely think we'll keep it on then. We are at time. Does anyone have anything else before we wrap up for today? Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Love having the participation. Oh, Antonino, I don't know if you're clapping or if you're trying to clap and then hit raise your hand.
No, it was real quick. When do we expect export STF code on the portal?
That is in private preview, and it is available in rc.portal.azure.com, which is release candidates. That will require registration for you to get access to. Public preview, we really want by the end of the year, but that might not be until 2025, but we're hoping that we can get that in ms.portal along with the public preview. So you just need to register the feature and you're good to go in January. That's our hope. So
Thank you.
awesome. Another one here about subscription vending. That looks really helpful. Thank you for dropping that, Colin. I know subscription vending is quite an experience for everyone. So, all right, we will let you all go. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Have a great Thanksgiving. Eat some turkey or don't if you don't like turkey. But we'll see everybody in December. So thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen.
Cheers.
See you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.